everyone. In my previous video entitled Why Theism is Rational but Naturalistic Atheism is Not, I gave a quick critique of how Darwinism specifically renders any conclusions we make about naturalism irrational. But the primary focus of that video was on my argument of how presupposing the axiom logic is valid necessarily leads to certain key attributes that all Western theists at least ascribe to God via generic theism. Of course, when referring to the word rational, I probably should have mentioned that in the previous video I'm referring to the specific philosophical definition, which comes from the Greek understanding of mathematics, whereby the word rational gets its root from the word ratio. In other words, just to be clear, I'm not making a psychological claim about rationality and irrationality, but instead a logical claim, wherein one system of belief fits the rules of logic, and therefore is rational, under the concepts of logic. But regarding the argument about Darwinism specifically, if you're familiar with the philosophy on this topic, you might recognize this is sort of a summary of Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. What's interesting about this argument, at least for me, is that I actually came up with the argument independently about 2 to 3 years before I'd even heard the name Alvin Plantinga. Although he was far more detailed on the logic of it, given his actual job as a philosopher and a teacher, so he said it better. In any case, though, I wanted to dig deeper into that side of my previous argument, since I think it's important to contrast just why belief in Darwinian evolution in particular is so fatal to the epistemological underpinnings of naturalism. But in order to explain that, first I'll need to describe 2 important features of any philosophical point of view. In order for a philosophical point of view to work, it has to have several key aspects. At minimum, it must have a metaphysical understanding of reality. That is, an understanding of what is real. And wrapped up tightly with the metaphysic is the epistemological method. Epistemology covers the question of how do you know what you know? Additionally, there is a system of ethics or morality, which is how people ought to behave. Some people include a philosophy of aesthetics, what is beauty. Politics is another one. But for now, I just want to focus on the metaphysical and the epistemological aspects of naturalism. The metaphysical claim of naturalism is that everything that exists is part of the natural world. And since the natural world is usually defined as material existence, then often naturalism and materialism are used interchangeably. As I briefly mentioned in my previous video, this worldview limits existence to only that which is part of the natural order, or, in the case of immaterial thoughts, that which is derived immediately from physical processes. To that end, naturalists don't deny all immaterial existence, since they will regularly acknowledge that immaterial concepts such as love, the knowledge of mathematics, the laws of logic, and the existence of imagined items such as imagining a red ball all exist because they are formed from the physical matter that makes up the human brain. Without the brain, there is no love, no math, no logic, and no imagined red balls. The naturalist worldview then, by definition, must deny the existence of anything supernatural, given that the very word supernatural implies something that exists outside of and apart from the natural order of things. Some naturalists, as I mentioned, are agnostic as to whether or not the supernatural does exist, so long as supernatural is defined as not having the ability to interact at all with the material world. But most of them would then assert that the existence of anything that can have no interaction with the material world which we inhabit would be equivalent to non-existence anyway. So there's really no point in pretending such supernatural existence is real. It doesn't really mean anything. It's a meaningless reality if that's the case. So that's the metaphysical claim. The only real things are either physical or the strict result of physical processes, period. Next, the epistemological claim. How do we know what we know? For example, a basic question we could ask the naturalist is, how do you know that naturalism is true? Or to put it even more bluntly, does proof of naturalism exist somewhere in nature? I would leave that question to actual naturalists to answer, as it's not my hill to die upon. Regardless, when it comes to epistemology, there are a couple different paths that one can take. And the point here isn't to go into great detail as to what those specific methods actually are, but instead to point out the common ground that any such method must have. Whatever epistemology is chosen, be it empiricism, be it a strict adherence to the scientific method, be it logical formalism, whatever, each of them needs to remain consistent with the metaphysical claim that is put forth in order for this to work. That is, none of them can ever seek out something beyond the natural realm as the reason why they can know what they know. And that limitation is key to how naturalism is undermined by Darwinism. Which brings me to my next point. Now that we have a basic understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of naturalism, we need to discuss deeper what Darwinism is. As I mentioned before, Darwinism is best summed up by the phrase survival of the fittest. Darwin himself did not make up that term, but he did state that it was equivalent to his own theory. One thing that we can point out is that no one today is actually a Darwinist, since Darwin's own idea of how modifications came about was disproven scientifically when genetics was discovered. But most people today still hold on to the term Darwinist, maybe neo-Darwinism, and they assert that it's random mutations that happen during cell division. That's how the differences get introduced into a species. Then survival of the fittest happens, or descent with modification, as Darwin would have said. So what is that concept? Basically, it means that on average, any organism that is more fit to the environment has a greater chance of living and producing offspring that will share its characteristics. Thus, a survivability advantage that is even relatively small will eventually succeed because those are the characteristics that the survivors will end up with. And it's necessary to point out that Darwinism does not work on the individual level, but it's the entire species that is improved, where improvement here is defined as whatever fits better to the current environment. This also means that if the environment changes, what was fit may no longer be fit. But Darwinism still takes over because now the new fittest species has the advantage in survival and is more likely to have more offspring that survive. To that end, Darwinism is really a tautology. That is, no matter how a species evolves, even along contradictory paths, it is still because of Darwinism. But there are viciously circular arguments which are logically disqualified, and then there are non-viciously circular arguments which, while still being circular, actually advance our understanding of a topic. And Darwinism, at least the part dealing with survival of the fittest, does fall into that second category. So to that end, Darwinism isn't really scientific in the sense of being a theory that can predict which species will survive. If you have two species, you don't know which one will make it, but it does explain how the species that do survive did so. So it's closer to a statistical model, like out of mathematics. Similar to how we know that there is cosmic microwave background radiation, because we have sensors that pick it up. Now, we don't know which bits are from the remnants of the Big Bang, but we know that some of what we're seeing must be because of a statistical analysis. In the same way, we don't necessarily know what feature made it so that one organism survived and another went extinct, but we know that whatever it was must have provided a survivability advantage. That's the kind of argument that Darwinism presents. And to be clear, that aspect of the argument from Darwinism, I have no problem with. Even my own view accepts that. Now, the reason I don't call myself a Darwinist is because I don't think the current neo-Darwinist idea of genetic mutations actually is sufficient to explain how evolution occurs, how the variations occur. But going in depth on that would need a completely new video. So for now, the point is that Darwinism weeds out the unfit organisms, and that's the key element for why evolution itself ultimately renders naturalism untenable. To explain how, we once again return to our epistemological question. How does a naturalist know what he or she knows? And the answer, regardless of what epistemological method is chosen, must go back to Darwinism. After all, there is no supernatural or independent immaterial existence. We can only go by what happens in the natural realm. And in the natural realm, every single organism got the way it did because of Darwinian selection. This includes every single physical attribute, including our very brains themselves. Remember, All our immaterial thoughts are the direct results of the physical processes of our brain. And our brains are the way they are because our brains gave us the ability to survive better than other brains did. The inferior brains died out. But how were they inferior? They were only inferior in the context of the environments we live in. The brains that survive and reproduce are necessarily the brains of those who the environment did not kill. Now, this doesn't imply that human brains were smarter. Indeed, if we want to talk about just the success of breeding, it seems to me that insect brains have an advantage given how many trillions of those organisms there are. But when dealing with the organisms that have higher intelligence, our brains came about because the brains we have were better able to survive, not necessarily because our brains were more correct in how to think. Remember, all our thoughts are the direct result of the physical brain. Thus, all our thoughts that we hold to are held not because they are true, but because they were selected for. Darwinism doesn't care about truth. It only cares about having an organism survive long enough to reproduce. Now again, here's the issue. Our brains are completely physical. In naturalism, this means so are our immaterial thoughts. What we are capable of believing is therefore determined not by our subjective experience of will, but instead by what the physical meat that we have evolved permits us to believe. The physical controls the mental. We cannot think a thought unless our brains evolve to permit us to think that thought. And the thoughts we think are not based on what is true, but only on what made us survive. And as I mentioned, a quick look through history shows that there are far more theists than there are atheists, which means, first of all, that our brains were selected for theism. And secondly, that if naturalism is true, this selected belief is false. Now, I have heard a naturalist explain how false beliefs can still help us survive. And he gave the example of a primitive caveman believing a monster exists in the forest. So his group of people wouldn't go out into the forest. As a result, they didn't get killed by bears in the forest. And they lived, had children, and their children believed that there were monsters too. But those who scorned the idea of the monster went out and they got killed by the bears. And thus they didn't pass on their genes. So as a result, the false belief that there were monsters in the forest was selected for. But as interesting as it is, the problem with that analogy is that the false belief in God has to be based on something in reality for the belief to actually provide a real survival benefit. After all, while there were no mythical monsters in the forest, there still were bears. So what's the correlation that can make people think that there is a God when there really isn't? Something about that concept of God must be real enough to provide an actual benefit to survival, or this whole thing doesn't even begin to pan out. Now, you might argue, it doesn't necessarily mean that theism gives a survivability advantage itself. Maybe it's just the case that both atheism and theism provide the same level of survivability. But it happened that theism was first, so there are more theists because there were simply just more of them to begin with. And whether a theist or atheist lives or dies is dependent upon completely other different factors, not on that belief. So the problem with that is that Darwinism, again, operates on the statistical method. Remember that whatever helps someone survive is going to be what eventually wins out. So if it is not the actual belief or non-belief of theism that provides the advantage, there must be something that goes along with the belief that does provide the advantage. Or, mathematically, we should see an even distribution of theism to atheism if they both provide the same impact on survivability. And also, I have to point out that this clearly is a nail in the coffin of the new atheist claim that religion is objectively bad and the cause for all the evil in the world. Because if that was the case, then clearly theism would have died out long ago and been replaced by the pacifist atheistic ideal. The mathematical function of Darwinism indicates that theists must have some kind of advantage over atheists, even if it's not the specific belief itself. Whatever it is that makes a human brain believe in God must be giving some kind of advantage above and beyond what it is that makes a human brain unable to believe in God. The disparity would not be so stark if it wasn't the case. Regardless, we are left with the following fact. Darwinism selected for human brains that believe in theism, and a smaller number of human brains that believe in naturalism. But the belief in naturalism itself commits one to the belief that Darwinism is selecting against naturalism by the simple fact that theism is so firmly entrenched into the very human brain that the naturalist believes created all of these immaterial thoughts in the first place. Darwinism doesn't care about what is true or not. Remember, in fact, to say that Darwinism selects anything is actually to reify Darwinism and personalize it, when really Darwinism doesn't choose anything at all, since it's not a mind. It can't make any choices. Thus, the problems with naturalism are exposed by Darwinism. First, theists have a survivability advantage, despite the fact that theism is false. Secondly, naturalists have a disadvantage, despite the fact that naturalism is true. Third, the same processes that work to evolve the human brain that holds to the false belief in theism work to create the brain that holds to the true belief that naturalism is true. But we know for a fact that theism is false because there are no supernatural entities, which undermines the trust that we can have that naturalism is actually true. In point of fact, theists subjectively believe they are correct just as much as naturalists subjectively believe they are correct. So the certainty of belief in your view, and indeed the inability to even understand how the other view could be right, isn't any indication that your metaphysical view is actually correct. Thus, the very groundwork by which you would create your epistemology to know how you know anything has been uprooted by the fact that the natural processes that create your beliefs also created the beliefs that are in direct contradiction to your own. In short, at best, Darwinism has created brains that are contradictory to reality, and you hope yours isn't one of them. At worst, it was. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.